recession. People don't, people just think the economy is improving, but it's not. So at some point, the world is going to wake up. It's not that far off. I don't think it's decades off. I mean, it might not even be years. It could happen in a matter of months. You never know. You don't know exactly how short the fuse is, but you know that it's attached to a bomb, and that it is going to go off. And so at some point, the creditors won't buy. And now interest rates start to move up, right? Or you start to see it more. You start to see the inflation. The Fed. One of the reasons the Fed can claim that, or they can keep interest rates so low, is they can claim that there's no inflation, even though oil prices are going up, food prices are going up. They don't actually look at those prices. They look at the government statistics. And according to government statistics, there's not a lot of inflation. All right, well, but that doesn't mean there isn't inflation, just because the government claims there's not inflation. But even at some point, those statistics are going to reveal more inflation. In fact, just recently, last month, even government prices were up like 5 or 0.6% in a month, which was a pretty big increase in prices. And look at the price of gasoline in California. I mean, it's at record highs, and so prices are rising. Right? And at some point, they're going to rise to the extent that no one is going to believe the Fed or the government. They claim that there's no inflation. And so then, what is the Fed going to do? Because the Fed has claimed, well, if there's ever any inflation, then we're going to raise interest rates. Well, they're just lying. They know they can't raise interest rates, because then the party's over. If they raise interest rates, the whole thing is going to implode. So what will the Fed do? Maybe the Fed will try to claim for a while, well, a little inflation is a good thing. It's nothing to worry about. It's just temporary. It's a sign that we've won our fight against deflation. Which is probably one of the biggest government propaganda victories, to manage to convince people that falling prices are a bad thing. Right? They've gotten us to fear. Right? Like according to the government, the worst thing that could possibly happen is the price of the things that you want to buy go down. And the government is going to save us from having to suffer that scourge. And when you talk to these economists, you say, tell me again, why is it that falling prices are bad? And the answer they always say is, well, the economy will freeze up because people will stop spending. Nobody will buy stuff if prices are going down. I say, really? I mean, first of all, maybe these big, the economists, if they'd ever run a store, they had a retail store, they would know. Right? If you want to sell stuff, you have a sale. Right? And the sale is where you take the price and you lower it. And then people come rushing in to buy. Right? If anybody had a sale and they said, hey, we got a sale for today only 10% extra, is anybody going to come in to buy that? I mean, the whole thing is asinine to say that people won't buy things if the prices are going down. I mean, everybody in this room probably has a cell phone. And if I had this seminar 20, 25 years ago, maybe only a couple people in this room would have a cell phone. And so why? Well, 20 years ago, they were $2,500 a piece. Not that many people bought them, and they were big. You had to carry the briefcase. You couldn't put it in your pocket. Yeah. Imagine if the first cell phone was the cheapest cell phone, and they just got more expensive. How many people would own them? The reason that we all own them is because the price came down. Deflation. That's why we all bought them. Now, according to the government, you won't buy something if you think the price is going to go down. Yes, you will. We all know the price is going to go down. We buy it anyway. The only people who don't buy something and are waiting for a lower price, they don't buy it because they can't afford it. They're waiting for the price to come down low enough so they can afford it. If you can't afford it and it goes up, well, then you really can't afford it. I mean, that's what I did. The first plasma television, I remember that came out, I remember looking at it in a store. It was like $10,000. I liked it. I mean, if they'd given it to me, I'd have taken it. But I didn't buy it because I liked the $10,000 more than that television set. But now I've got them in every room because they're cheap. And so it was the falling prices that created all the demand. That's why I went and bought them. Now I was talking to my dad the other day about the first television set. he said the first television set he saw was the size of a refrigerator. And this, had a little screen in it. And it was black and white, and you had like one channel, and it was on for 2 hours a day, and it was really nothing to watch. And it was like the equivalent of buying a car. Yet somebody bought it. Some rich guy bought it as a lark just to show his friends. But then the prices started to come down. So it's falling prices. And so the government likes to pretend that falling prices are bad because they want to create inflation. And so that's an excuse. Right? In fact, when they established the Federal Reserve, the idea was to have price stability. See, now the idea isn't price stability, because according to the Fed, price stability is a bad thing. Because if prices are stable, there's too big a risk that they might go down. So now the Fed's goal is to have at least 2% inflation every year. They have to destroy the value of our money by at least 2% a year. That's their goal. Imagine, look at all the inflation they created when the goal was price stability. I'm afraid now their actual goal is inflation now. Imagine how much they're going to exceed that goal. But initially, they might try to claim that, this is a good thing. But then inflation gets worse. Because the minute the world perceives correctly the box the Fed is in, the minute the confidence isn't there, right? In fact, my father went on a conference that Ron Paul had about 25 years ago. He had a hard money conference in Washington, D.C. And everybody went to the Fed. And my father asked a question to, I guess, whoever was, talking to the group. And he said, what's backing our money? What's backing the dollar? What gives it value? And the answer that he got from the Fed official was confidence. Confidence. It's a confidence game. That's all it is. And if the confidence is gone, and the confidence is that you're going to keep it scarce, because fiat money has no intrinsic value. It's just a piece of paper. So what gives it value is the confidence that people have that it will be scarce. Well, how anyone can even think that now is beyond me. But people believe the Fed when the Fed says, look, if inflation ever picks up, well, then we're going to shrink our balance sheet. Then we're going to raise interest rates and rein in all this liquidity. But of course they're not going to do that. How could they possibly do that? Because if they did that, we'd have a much bigger crisis than we had in 2008. And remember, if the Fed is tightening, there are no bailouts. The reason that the government was able to bail out Wall Street was because the Fed made it possible. If the Fed is tightening, if the Fed is selling government bonds and raising interest rates, bailouts are impossible. So if you take Ben Bernanke at his word, that if inflation ever picks up, the Fed's going to fight it with tight money policies, then you have to believe that Ben Bernanke is going to stand by and watch all the big banks fail and do nothing about it. That the Fed is going to stand by and watch the government default on its debt and do nothing about it. And not only would the banks fail if the Fed was tightening, right? Not only would the banks fail, not only would the stockholders get wiped out, not only would the bondholders get wiped out, but the depositors would get wiped out. Think about that. The government has to sit back and watch voters lose their checking accounts and their savings accounts. Wiped out. Because there's no money in the FDIC. The FDIC would need a bailout. If Bank of America failed, there's not enough money in the FDIC. They need a bailout. But how is the federal government going to bail out the Bank of America when it's broke itself and there's no one to bail it out? So the reality is that's not what's going to happen. The Fed is not going to slam on the brakes, right? It's not going to stop the inflation as soon as it sees it. It's going to accept it. It's going to tolerate it. And when our creditors realize that that's the situation, right, that the Fed is not going to stop inflation, it's just going to feed it, then the party's over. Because now there's no reason to stay in the dollar. And nobody will buy our bonds, right? The dollar can't be the reserve currency anymore once we basically accept that, right? Once people accept that reality, that the Fed can't control inflation, it has to just let it go. Because to try to slam on the brakes. Remember, when Paul Volcker did that, and, well, it's over my arm. So when Paul Volcker slammed on the brakes in 1980, and he raised interest rates up to 20%. That was tough. But we could afford to do it because we didn't have a national debt that's like an adjustable rate mortgage. We had long-term financing. And in 1980, 1981, we were still an industrial powerhouse. We had a trade surplus. We were the world's biggest creditor. We weren't the world's biggest debtor like we are today. Our factories were still here. People still had jobs to go back to. We had a viable economy in 1980. That's not the case today. That economy is gone. The credits are gone. We're up to our eyeballs in debt. So we can't do what Volcker did to protect the dollar and stop inflation. And when our creditors realize that, well, they're not going to buy our bonds at all. And now what happens? Now the Fed has to step up its QE. The Fed has to buy everything. And then it's not just government bonds that the Fed's going to buy. The Fed has to buy all the bonds. The corporate bonds, the muni bonds. Because once everybody realizes the dollar is in perpetual and permanent decline, if people accept the fact that the dollar is going to lose 10%, 20% of its value every year, right? Nobody is going to buy a bond that pays 5%, 8%. Why? You're guaranteed to lose money. So now interest rates are going to skyrocket for the states. Well, now the states are going to have to go bankrupt. Is the Federal Reserve going to let California default? Is it going to let, all these things? No. So now they have to start buying. QE is going to have to be expanded. We're going to have to buy municipal bonds. They're going to have to start buying corporate bonds. Because otherwise, what's going to happen in the United States? If corporate bonds skyrocket and all these levered companies go bankrupt. You can't have that happening. So now the Fed doesn't become the buyer of last resort. It's the only buyer. And now this just accelerates the process. Because where does the Fed get all the money to buy all the bonds that nobody wants at these artificially low interest rates? It has to create it out of thin air. And the more money it creates to buy bonds, the less the bonds are worth. Because it has to create inflation to buy the bonds. It has to debase the currency that the bonds are denominated in. And that just accelerates the process. And so then all of a sudden, you get to the point where you're about to have hyperinflation. And that is where we're going. That is the crisis that my book is dealing with. It's the real fiscal cliff. The fiscal cliff isn't this pothole that they're talking about, when the Bush tax cuts expire or these trivial spending cuts kick in. The real fiscal cliff is when interest rates rise and inflation rises, and we have to make a choice between default and collapse and hyperinflation. Because those are the only two choices. We can't pay the money back. The only choice we make is how do we default? Do we do it legitimately through a restructuring and deflation, or do we wipe it out with hyperinflation? But paying our debts back is a physical impossibility. We can't do that. Not when interest rates go up. But we can never have a legitimate recovery unless we let interest rates go up. That's the catch-22. The economy can't recover until rates go up. But if rates go up, we destroy the phony economy, which has to happen. We have to destroy this phony consumer-based economy in order to supplant it with a viable economy that produces and saves, and that's what we need. But we can't get from where we are now to where we have to be without a lot of short-term pain. But in order to avoid that pain, we're doing what we're doing. But there is a limit, because we get to the point where the whole thing is about to implode. Europe, many European countries in Europe are already at that point. And if you talk to the so-called experts, they'll say, well, America's not Greece, we never have to worry. And they say the reason is that Greece doesn't have a printing press, that Greece can't print euros. Okay, so we're supposed to relax because America has a printing press, so we're off the hook? Like the printing press is the get-out-of-jail-free card? See, right now people are worried about getting their money back. Right? They're worried about, hey, what if Greece defaults? I might not get my euros back. All right, but the greater concern is your purchasing power. Okay, so maybe America never defaults. It just inflates. And you get all your money back, but you can't buy anything with it. What's the difference between not getting your money back or getting money back that you can't buy anything with? It's the same thing. It's just default through another means. The problem is defaulting through inflation has worse ramifications for the economy than a legitimate default, because it destroys the economy more, and it impacts people who aren't even involved in the transaction. When the government defaults on debt, the loser is the bondholder. When the government creates inflation, everybody loses. Anybody who has dollars, even if you don't have government bonds, you lose. No matter what you did, if you have your money in dollars. That's why I say that the biggest losses are going to befall the holders of bonds, holders of cash. And it's unfortunate. You've got so many Americans who think they're playing it safe, and they're playing with fire. They think they're in the safe asset. They're in the riskiest asset of all. Inflation is going to wipe out a tremendous amount of wealth. It's going to transfer enormous amounts of wealth from debtors or from creditors to debtors. And of course, investors, savers, are the creditors that get wiped out. And what we're trying to do, and I'm going to open up and take your questions. I've already been talking longer than I intended. What we're trying to do is come up with investment strategies that reflect this, and that also reflect the world the way it's going to look, not the world the way it looks today. Because when the dollar implodes, our standard of living is going with it. I mean, we are going to see as Americans a substantial reduction in our standard of living. I mean, that's already taking place now. But it's going to take place even more when the dollar is no longer the reserve currency, and we can't trade the money we print for the stuff everybody else makes. At some point soon, we're going to have to produce if we want to consume. And, we can't do it. Not now. We don't have the savings, we don't have the capital, and we have too much regulation, too many taxes to ever recreate what we've lost. We're going to have a huge transformation as an economy, and we're going to have to rethink the way we govern ourselves. Because if we're ever going to get out of this hole, we need to go back to a free market economy. We can't have this centrally planned, high tax, high regulation economy that we have today, because it doesn't work. It only works because the world supports us, because the world sustains us by supplying us with the stuff that we don't produce and lending us the money that we don't save. But as I said, it's costing the world too much money. And so our investment strategies are going to reflect the world, not the way it looks today, but the way it's going to look tomorrow. Because you have a whole world out there of emerging market consumers who have been saving, working hard, and under-consuming. They're the consumers of the future, not Americans. Right? There's that old expression, shop till you drop, right? Well, we did it. And we're done shopping. We're going to have to start making stuff. And so the economy is going to change. The global economy is going to change. And you have to recognize how that is going to change so that you can invest, to ride that wave and not get clobbered by that wave, which unfortunately most people are going to get washed away. But I'm going to open it up and take questions for until 8. So we have a mic over there, and a mic over there. So if anybody that has questions about anything, they can just come up and ask me. Go ahead.
Welcome to Chicago, the city of vote early and vote often.
Yes. I understand you guys just gave your teachers a well-deserved raise. They were working too hard, too. Those 5 3/4-hour days. Yeah.
You are a very smart man, so when I send you an invoice for the $1 million that you owe me, you are not going to go bankrupt in order to try to pay me. You're going to have your lawyer send me a letter saying, Mr. Schiff doesn't know you, doesn't owe you a nickel. You're going to,
I wouldn't even bother having my lawyer send you a letter. I just would.
Yeah. So, I was glancing through your book, and you suggest that the United States goes bankrupt.
We are bankrupt. We just have to admit it.
Yeah. Why can't we repudiate the debt?
Well, we can.
Tar and feather all the people that were involved with the...
Well, we can. Well, my solution for the debt problem is to restructure and pay less than 100 cents on the dollar, but pay with legitimate money. But I think what we have to do is go to our creditors and say, look, you loaned us all this money, we can't possibly pay you back. Right? So, and we're going to come up with a haircut. Just like, Greece imposed a haircut. We said we're going to pay you 50 cents on the dollar, we're going to pay you 40 cents on the dollar. But it's not just our bondholders, and I don't want to give the bondholders nothing. Right? I think that they should get something. But in many cases, look, people that were dumb enough to loan our government money deserve to lose. What do they, plus, as an American taxpayer, I didn't want any of these loans. Often, like, I go to China, I go to Saudi Arabia, and I speak, and I tell, in an audience, I say, don't buy any treasuries. And people say, oh, Peter, look, he's a traitor. He's telling the Saudis not to buy treasuries. You're damn right I don't want the Saudis loaning money to the U.S. government. Why? So they can squander it and obligate me to pay it back? If everybody stopped loaning money to the U.S. government, they couldn't borrow any more money. They'd have to cut back on their spending. So I don't want anybody, subsidizing, our profligacy. But look, I don't want to just go and say you get nothing. But we've got to restructure across the board all of our obligations. We have to be honest with government retirees and say, look, this is what you were promised, but we can't deliver it. And you never should have expected that you were going to get all this money anyway. You extorted all these huge promises because the politicians knew that you would help elect them. So we got to tell people, look, you were promised a pension, you're going to get half of what you were promised, or whatever it's going to be. We got to go to government workers who are working right now and say, look, you're going to have to take a 50% pay cut. This is it. We're just cutting this is all we can afford. And we got to go to people on Social Security and say, look, this is what you were promised, but you know what? The money's not there. So this is all you're going to get. And some people, well, you're not going to get anything. Some people, well, this is what you're going to get. But everybody has to take a haircut because the government can't pay what it's promised without destroying the economy. And it's not like there's a choice between, everybody can get what they've been promised. Either you're going to get less, or you're going to get paid in money that buys less. And my way, I think people will have a lot more, even though they have their benefits reduced. Because if we don't reduce anybody's benefits, we're going to wipe out everybody's benefits, because the benefits will be worthless. And so what good is it if you get all your money back, you get all your Social Security, you get all your pension, if you can't buy anything? And so, by restructuring, and the thing is, if we restructure, we can let interest rates go up. The reason we can't let interest rates go up is because there's too much debt. We can't afford to pay it. But we're never going to have a real economy unless we have a real interest rate. So if we get rid of a lot of the debt, then we can let interest rates go up. But as long as we have all the debt, we can never let rates go up, which means we can never recover.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for coming to Chicago, Mr. Schiff. I'd like to ask you a question about the bond market. Where do you look at? I likewise believe in your belief of the real crash, and looking at the bond market. Where do you see the bond market as a trigger for that possible crash? Do you look at the 30-year, the 10-year?
Well, I look at them. They're still in bubbles. They haven't even gone down yet. So, you can look at the dollar, look at the gold market, see how much value the dollar has lost in terms of gold. But the bond bubble hasn't burst yet. And, it's going to. It's burst in other countries. It just hasn't burst here. And in fact, as I said earlier, we're benefiting from all that. People are buying the dollar because they're afraid of all the other debt, even though we are in a bigger mess than a lot of the countries whose debt people are selling to buy dollars. It's just that since everybody perceives the dollar is safe because of confidence, well, it is safe. But again, everybody perceived that subprime mortgages were safe. Everybody perceived, in internet stocks, until perception changes. And it happens very quickly. That's the problem. You have a sovereign debt crisis almost overnight. See, people have confidence until they don't. And when there's no confidence and no one wants to buy, the bottom drops out of the market. And so, and then either the Fed steps up and just prints, or they just let the bottom fall out. But either way, it's going to be a very bad outcome. It's just one is worse than the other. But for political reasons, it's more expedient to inflate than to honestly default. But that crisis is coming. And, it's not coming, far into the future. But you can't, there's no way to really, I don't think there's any way to look at a bond chart and be able to know, okay, yes, the crisis is coming. Unless it's obvious to everybody. I don't think I'll be able to figure it out and nobody else will. By the time you can tell in the bond market that there's a crisis, it's too late. It's already there. Everybody knows about it. Because there's no way to know when that bubble's going to burst. Right? And so far, we're still, up near the highs. The yields are still just below 3% on the 30-year. We're still below 2% on a 10-year. Mortgage rates are ticking at record lows. Despite all this debt, and despite the fact that we've promised to print money indefinitely. how anybody can want to buy these bonds. It's amazing. But, I didn't know how people were buying condos, in Miami or Vegas or Phoenix as long as they did, but they did, but then all of a sudden, they couldn't do it anymore.
And also, I know silver's going up for average expectation a year from now. Just you could throw out a number.
Well, I think it's going a lot higher. I think a year from now, there's a good chance it'll be over the $50 mark. $50 was the last high. And a lot of it also depends too on, what's happened. Have we had the bursting of the bond bubble yet, or are we still able to borrow at these ridiculously low rates? But I think it's obvious to me, gold and silver going up. They've been going up now for 12 years. And the dynamics that have been driving those markets are just going to expand. More and more banks are going to want to own gold. More and more central banks and private banks. What are you going to own? All the countries have their interest rates too low. Everybody is creating inflation. Everybody's got negative interest rates. So in that environment, paper money is not a store of value. So more and more people are, people still want to save. They just want to save something that's going to be worth something when they want to spend it. And so more people are going to save the gold. And unfortunately, that is not conducive to economic growth because the gold isn't loaned out to anybody. At some point, we can have gold loans and people can make a loan in gold so a businessman can borrow in gold and repay in gold. And the banking system can evolve in that direction. But in the short run, most people who have gold put it in a vault somewhere. They don't put it into a financial institution where it can be loaned out. And so we're destroying capitalism because we're destroying capital accumulation. Because in order to accumulate capital, somebody has to underconsume and save so that there are resources available to build factories, to build machines. And we're not doing that because we're destroying savings. The government has declared a war because we have so much debt. All the government cares about is propping up the debtor. And even if it's not the voters who are debtors, the U.S. government is the world's biggest debtor. And so it has to pursue policies that benefit the debtor. But when you destroy the saver, you destroy capitalism. And we've already done that. And so it's just a question of, when this whole thing implodes. But you can tell that it's happening. All these things that are happening, the financial crisis, it wasn't an accident. This is part of the process of unwinding this phony economy. And the government is doing everything it can to delay the day of reckoning. But unfortunately, the more they delay it, the worse it is. Because now we have more to reckon with. Because not only do we have the mistakes of the past, but we have the new mistakes that we're creating today because we don't want to deal with the mistakes of the past. They talk about, kicking the can down the road or sweeping it under the rug, but eventually you got to deal with it. And of course, the longer you wait, the worse it is. And we've been doing this for a long time, so we are looking at a massive, massive implosion in the United States. And the scary thing for me is what happens afterwards. What does the nation become? The optimistic side of me is that we learn our lesson finally because it's so bad. We get such a big taste of socialism that we can't stomach it anymore. We puke it all out. And we go back to capitalism and freedom. And we just start repealing regulations and abolishing agencies and trying to unleash capitalism again and learn from our mistakes. Or the other alternative is that we blame it all on capitalism, which is what Obama would want to do, and we deliberately recreate America under a centrally planned totalitarian model because we're convinced that capitalism doesn't work. And even though history is replete with examples that socialism works, they'll give it a try again. And so it's a scary position to know that we're going to approach that fork, which is one of the reasons that I talk as much as I do and I try to get free market ideas out there so that more people might embrace them and so that more people know what's coming. Because when the last crisis hit, the mainstream media acted as if nobody could have possibly seen it coming, like it totally came out of left field. Even though, no, it was very obvious. It wasn't a surprise. It was only a surprise to fools. It was, I knew it was coming. And so I want other people to know what is about to come is not just some random chance event that nobody could have predicted. It is the predictable consequences of the bad government policy. And it's not a failure of capitalism, it's a failure to have capitalism.
Yeah, okay, thanks for coming.
Thanks for knowing